Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to go my review of Halloween Havoc 1991. Starting off the evening, we go to our first match of the night. It is the Chambers of Horror match. It's a good match, back and forth matchup with everybody involved in the match. Rick Steiner hits a belly-belly suplex on Abdullah into the electric chair, if you will. Cactus Jack doesn't see that Abdullah's in the chair. He ends up pulling the lever. Abdullah, gets electrified, if you will, not literally. But your winners of the match are El Gigante, the Steiners, and Sting. A couple things I want to say about this matchup, man, really quickly. Number one, this is a pure definition of why I'm not a fan of these gimmick matches, man. The Chamber of Horrors match, not a big fan. I'm really not. And the way they set the match up, it seemed very lackadaisical. To be honest with you, I feel like it shouldn't have been the first match on or shouldn't have been booked at all. Not only that, you had Sting in this matchup, which is great. Big fan of Sting, but you also had Sting at the time as the United States Heavyweight Champion for WCW at that time. Why could we not get Sting a more predominant matchup on a pay-per-view known as Halloween Havoc to defend that championship? Why is he in a Chamber of Horrors match with all these different people? I didn't really understand that at all, or that concept. Not only that, the way that the chamber was set up, it seemed like it was more of a steel cage hardcore match. And I just wasn't a big fan of it, man. They lowered down this chair, this electric chair, if you will, and how you got to win this matchup was that you put your opponent in that chair, somebody pulls down the lever, fireworks go off to play it off as if someone's getting electrocuted, so on and so forth. It just seemed very gimmicky, and I just wasn't a big fan of it, man. I really wasn't. And to be honest with you, I really don't know why that match was booked. I get it. It's Halloween Havoc. You want to make it fun and kind of scary for the fans, but it seemed really, really just gimmicky. It just was not needed, man. But hats off to El Gigante and the Steiners as well as Sting for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It's a tag team matchup. It is Big Josh and PN News versus the Creatures. Again, I thought this was an okay match. Back and forth matchup between both teams with PN News and Big Josh keeping the pace of the match. But PN News ultimately hits the finish, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are PN News and Big Josh. Hats off to Big Josh and PN News for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night as well. It is Terrence Taylor versus Bobby Eaton. I thought this was an okay matchup as well. Back and forth matchup between Taylor and Eaton, with Taylor keeping the pace of the match. But Eaton ultimately hits his signature leg drop off the top rope, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Bobby Eaton. Hats off to Bobby Eaton for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night as well. It is Jimmy Garvin versus Johnny B. Bad. I thought this was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Garvin and Bad, with Garvin keeping the pace of the match. Garvin hits a devastating power slam on Johnny B. Bad in the middle of the ring. Garvin then hits a signature DDT on Johnny B. Bad in the middle of the ring. Theodore then causes a distraction with the referee. Johnny then hits Garvin with a right hook, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Johnny B. Bad. Hats off to Johnny B. Bad for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night as well. It is for the WCW Television Championship. It is Dustin Rhodes versus Steve Austin. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Rhodes and Austin, with Dustin keeping the pace of the match. Dustin then hits a power slam on Austin. Dustin then hits a bionic elbow on Austin for a near fall. But this match ends in a time limit draw, and Austin retains the WCW Television Championship. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night as well. It is Oz versus Bill Kazmaier. I thought this was an okay matchup. The one interesting thing that I'll say about this match was actually seeing Bill Kazmaier in a WCW wrestling ring. A lot of people who don't know who Bill Kazmaier is, he's a former World's Strongest Man. Broke a lot of records. So it was kind of odd to see, him in a wrestling capacity when this guy's pretty much known for competing in the World's Strongest Man. He holds multiple records in the World's Strongest Man. And it was kind of weird to see Bill Kazmaier there. But all in all, he did, he held his own against Oz. Like I said, the match itself, it was kind of lackadaisical. I feel like Oz was trying to do everything he could to carry the match. with Bill Kazmaier. Back and forth matchup though, but Oz was keeping the pace. But Kazmaier ultimately hits a torture rack on Oz with ease. And your winner of the match is Bill Kazmaier. Hats off to Bill Kazmaier for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Doug Summers versus Van Hammer. I thought it was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Summers and Van Hammer, with Hammer keeping the pace of the match. Van Hammer ultimately hits the finish, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Van Hammer. Hats off to Van Hammer for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Light Heavyweight Championship. It is Brian Pillman versus Richard Morton. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Pillman and Morton, with Pillman keeping the pace of the match. And Pillman ultimately hits his signature crossbody off the top rope, pins Morton for the 3, and your winner of the match, and at that time, new WCW Light Heavyweight Champion, is Brian Pillman. Hats off to Brian Pillman for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the Z-Man versus the WCW Halloween Havoc Phantom. I thought this match was downright awful. Phantom was pretty much keeping the pace throughout the entire match, with Phantom ultimately hitting a devastating neck breaker on the Z-Man, pins him for the 3, and your winner of the match is the Halloween Havoc Phantom. Couple of things I'm going to say about this matchup quickly, man, because I'm not going to waste a whole lot of time on it. Number one, like I said, this match was awful. Z-Man, that I don't know who that guy is, man, but I mean the name just fits him perfectly. Every time you watch this guy wrestle, you want to fall asleep, man. Lackadaisical. There's just no talent there, man. I'm sorry. If you're a Z-Man fan, I do apologize, but that guy cannot. He can't wrestle. He cannot wrestle. Throughout the entire night for this pay-per-view, everybody, including Missy Hyatt, you hear Tony Schiavone and Jim Ross on commentary, Eric Bischoff, were trying to, figure out who this Halloween Havoc Phantom was. I knew exactly who it was before they even announced who it was towards the end of the night. The Halloween Havoc Phantom was none other than Rick Rude. Rick Rude debuted that night for WCW. They ended up unmasking the Phantom towards the end of the show, and it ended up being Rick Rude. But just judging on the way the Phantom looked, the signature neck breaker that he hit on the Z-Man, it was straight out of Rick Rude's playbook. So I knew it was exactly Rick Rude. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It's for the WCW Tag Team Championships. It is the Enforcers versus the Patriots. I thought this was an okay match. Back and forth matchup between the Enforcers and the Patriots, with the Enforcers keeping the pace of the match. But Arn Anderson ultimately hits a devastating spine buster, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match. And at that time, still, WCW Tag Team Champions are the Enforcers. Hats off to the Enforcers for getting a win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the main event of Halloween Havoc 1991. It is Lex Luger defending the WCW Heavyweight Championship against Ron Simmons in a 2 out of 3 falls matchup. Number one, I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Lex Luger and Ron Simmons. Ron ends up hitting a devastating spine buster, pins for the 3. Ron wins the first fall. After that, Ron was keeping the pace of the match. Harley Race was ringside, ended up attacking Ron Simmons. And then Dusty Rhodes was also ringside for Ron Simmons. Dusty ends up attacking Harley Race ringside. Lex then goes over the ropes. Referee then disqualifies Ron Simmons, thinking that Ron Simmons ended up throwing Lex Luger over the ropes, which back then would call it a disqualification. That did not happen. Actually, Harley Race ended up attacking Ron Simmons by the ropes. Referee didn't see it. And then Lex wins the second fall by disqualification. Then Lex ultimately hits a paw driver on Ron Simmons in the middle of the ring that looked absolutely brutal. Pins him for the 3. And your winner of the match, and at that time, still WCW World Heavyweight Champion, is Lex Luger. A couple of things I'm going to say about Halloween Havoc 1991, man, before I get out of here. This was a very lackadaisical Halloween Havoc, in my honest opinion, man, from top to bottom. Like I said, the first match, the Chambers match, was downright awful. I'm not a big fan of the gimmick matches, and that just, to me, was a pure definition of why I don't. The match was all over the place. And again, I don't know why Sting was even booked in this match. For whatever reason, why he was not defending the United States Heavyweight Championship on Halloween Havoc baffles my mind. The match was it was too gimmicky for me, man. 100%. Big Josh and PN News versus the Creatures. Lackadaisical, man. Nobody even knew who the Creatures were. I mean, you hear Jim Ross and Tony Schiavone on the announce team, and they're like, well, we're just going to call them Creature number 1 and Creature number 2 because we have no idea who these guys are. I mean, tell me something I don't know, man. I mean, it was a lackadaisical match. 100%. You know, and Big Josh and PN News, they were carrying the match throughout the entire match, man. Very lackadaisical. Terrence Taylor versus Bobby Eaton. Again, very good matchup. And hats off to Bobby Eaton for getting the win in that match. Jimmy Garvin versus Johnny B. Bad. It was a decent match, man. A lot of people, you either like Johnny B. Bad or you hated Johnny B. Bad. Johnny B. Bad can wrestle, man. A.K.A. Mark Marrow. The guy can wrestle. Back then, Johnny B. Bad can wrestle. And a lot of people didn't like the gimmick. I really wasn't a big fan of the gimmick either. But Mark Marrow, a.k.a. Johnny B. Bad, he can wrestle. And I believe he also held the television championship quite a bit, I believe, for WCW back in the day. But hats off to Johnny B. Bad for getting the win in that match against Jimmy Garvin. Dustin Rhodes versus Steve Austin. That was a great match. For the television championship, fantastic match. A lot of people don't realize that Steve Austin actually did wrestle for WCW, which he did. He was known as Stunning Steve Austin, as well as the Hollywood Blondes when he was tag team with Brian Pillman. So it was great to see Steve Austin. Again, a great match between Dustin Rhodes and Steve Austin, but Austin ends up retaining the television championship at that time due to a time limit draw. Oz versus Bill Kazmaier. Wasn't a big fan of it, man, to be honest with you. I feel like Oz, and I stated this multiple times in the past as well, Oz was one of the worst characters I think WCW almost ever came up with, period. One of them. Obviously, it was a huge knockoff to the Wizard of Oz. I wasn't a big fan. I mean, even when Oz debuted, they had, like, you know, the Wizard of Oz cast there almost when he made his debut match. It was very cringe, man. It just was not needed. Bill Kazmaier, I mean, he held his own. He ended up getting the win in this match with a torture rack straight out of Lex Luger's playbook, and he ended up securing the win. So, hats off to Bill Kazmaier for securing the win in that matchup. Van Hammer versus Doug Summers. It was a decent match. I think this was Van Hammer's debut for WCW. It was a decent match. It wasn't the greatest. It was pretty much a glorified squash. But hats off to Van Hammer for getting the win in that matchup. Brian Pillman versus Richard Morton for the Light Heavyweight Championship. It was a decent match, man. I mean, you're not going to get a bad match between Pillman and Richard Morton. So, hats off to Pillman for getting the win in that matchup. The Halloween Havoc Phantom, like I stated earlier. The match itself against, you know, the Phantom and the Z-Man was awful, but it was cool to see that the Phantom was none other than Rick Rude. And he ended up debuting that night for WCW. And then the main event, Lex Luger versus Ron Simmons for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. It was a good match, man, but I thought Ron Simmons was going to get the win in that matchup, but Luger ended up securing the win and remained at that time the World Heavyweight Champion. As far as a rating for Halloween Havoc 1991, man, it's going to be low. It's probably a solid 4, maybe 4.5 at best. Like I said, very lackadaisical Halloween Havoc in my honest opinion. I'm not going to say it was the worst Halloween Havoc, but it damn sure was not the best Halloween Havoc I ever seen. But I'm going to give Halloween Havoc 1991 a solid 4 at best, man. But this is my review of Halloween Havoc 1991. I hope you guys are out there staying safe. Be careful, and remember, stay classic. Peace.